Welcome to the Cost of War panel. This is a part of this amazing exhibit brought by Mac from Chicago Veterans for Peace. Is Mac in the house? I know he's somewhere.
He was.
Well, let's give Mac a hand for this amazing exhibit. I run from 2 to 3 at the most, so you'll have a chance to see this exhibit. But if you feel the spirit move you, if you feel kind of pulled out during the panel, don't be shy, go ahead. It's really an incredible exhibit. It's interactive. We encourage you to also sign in and share your feelings and your thoughts. This is powerful, powerful stuff. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our friends at the Madison Museum, who have given us this amazing exhibit space and provided this wonderful room for free. And without the Madison, frankly, we couldn't do community events like this. So, and I see Peggy McDonald in the back. So a couple more things before I introduce our panelists to the panel. One is we also invite you to become a part of Veterans for Peace. We meet the first Wednesday of every month. In fact, we have a meeting coming up this Wednesday. We meet at 7 p.m. There's information out there. Also, if you would like to be interviewed by the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program around these kinds of events, we have a sign-up sheet for the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, which also direct is a co-sponsor of this event. And in the fall, our focus, our oral history internship, the focus is on veterans' experiences. And so we're really, this is one of the things we try to emphasize. So we're going to do a panel called The Cost of War, and in many ways it is spurred by the My Lai Massacre Memorial Exhibit, and we have 3 amazing people. And let me just talk about it for just a second. What we're going to do is we're going to go in order. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to actually introduce themselves and kind of give us some of their life histories. And we'll let them go in order, and then please hold your questions till the end. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to go, and then we'll kind of, at the end of that, we'll do Q&A. How does that sound?
Good.
Okay, very good. So our first panelist will be Patience Mason, and Patience has some of the wonderful productions and books that she's worked on with her, and she's going to speak, and then Richard Hutchins is going to speak about veterans issues. Mary Barr, and we passed out this piece that Mary wrote for this occasion, a wonderful reflection piece on Hugh Thompson, which is one of the things that she's going to talk about. So Patience, well actually let's go Patience, Mary, and Richard, so they'll have kind of well, thank you.
Well, I was married to my future Vietnam veteran before he even got in the Army, and people were being drafted, but he had signed up to learn how to fly helicopters because he was already a fixed-wing pilot in high school. So he managed to graduate from helicopter school, and we got a whole month at a nice base with a nice apartment and stuff like that. And then they said, dye your underwear green, but that doesn't mean you're going to Vietnam. And they sent him to Vietnam on a boat. So he was gone for a year, and the worst year of my life. Oh, I'm sorry. The worst year of my life. Can you hear me now? No, it's not. Okay, it's not even on.
How's that? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So it was the worst year of my life. And when he came back, I didn't even notice. He weighed 119 pounds. He's 5'11". So he looked like he'd been in a concentration camp or something like that. He was so skinny. And the look on his face, he's got the 1,000-yard stare, but I didn't notice because I was so happy to see him. And the first night, there was a noise like this. And it woke me up, and I looked over at him, and he was above the bed. That was the sound he made taking off. And that was my introduction to PTSD. And he did that for about 10 years, sometimes more, sometimes less. It became a family, oh, daddy's levitating again. He's going to be more cranky and stuff like that. So when he was writing this book, that's when I found out what it was like in Vietnam for him. This is a best-selling memoir that came out in 1983. And I started understanding. My mother was a psychiatrist at the VA, and she told him, smoke more pot and drink less because it's better for your brain. And she sent him vitamin B12, big bottles of it. And he was drinking a quart of whiskey a day, eating as many Valium, because they told him Valium was good for you. You can't take too much. It's not addictive. So he was eating a lot of Valium and smoking pot, and that just kept him down to wired. And these days I'm very grateful that he had that, because he might have died otherwise. So, we went up to Rayford and talked to a vets group, and they said, I wish you could talk to my wife. So I decided I would write a book for other wives. And I have a different attitude about post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's what I'm talking about. People think post-traumatic stress disorder is a problem. I think war is a problem. Rape is a problem. Any trauma is a problem. And PTSD is a solution to the problem. It's just how you survive. You get PTSD if you have a traumatic stressor, and if you have a brain, because your brain has all these survival skills built into it that later become the symptoms of PTSD. And you also get PTSD because you care, and you wouldn't have to get numb if you didn't give a shit. There's 4 traumatic stressors. When they're shooting at you, when they kill your friend, when your home and community is destroyed, that's, more natural disasters. But that happens to somebody who's wounded and taken away from his patrol and the other one is seeing anyone who's recently been seriously injured or killed. So there's 4 traumatic stressors, and most people in a war have hundreds of them. Hundreds of them, not just one. The people who get PTSD have the most exposure, the greatest losses, the least social support, and that was a big problem after Vietnam, and the fewest resources. And I always say that includes emotional, because if you came from a World War II veteran family where you never saw a man have a feeling that he didn't get drunk over or punch somebody, you don't have the resource to handle the painful feelings that come when you see people killed or people try to kill you. You just don't have it. So the 3 sets of symptoms in the original diagnosis are brain-based survival skills. Your brain is actually designed to pay attention to threat. That's what it does. It's looking for danger all the time. And once you've been traumatized, that doesn't go away. So the attention to threat leads to hypervigilance. It leads to startle responses. It leads to anger, because people are pissed off when people try to kill them. That's a very appropriate response, and it's effective, because if you are really pissed off, you can fight a lot harder. You're angry because people people have tried to kill you. You can't sleep because if you sleep deeply, you may wake up dead, and you're always looking for danger, which means that you can't concentrate on regular everyday shit. So you think you're dumb, or your wife thinks you pay no attention to her. I used to be so mad at Bob because he wouldn't hear what I said. And now I'm fine when he doesn't hear what I say because it means my voice is a safe sound and he doesn't have to pay attention to it. It's not dangerous. The second thing your brain does is it rapidly adapts. And rapid adaptation leads to numbness because the first time you kill somebody, you throw up. And by the third or fourth time, it's just regular everyday crap. Or, the first time you're mortared, whatever. You become rapidly adapted to it. And that leads to numbness. And it also leads to avoidance because you don't want to go back to that emotional state when somebody has just tried to kill you. The characteristics to go with this, first of all, you try to avoid thoughts or feelings associated with the trauma. And of course, alcoholism is the number one way to do that. But then there's, drug addiction, overeating. Nowadays, just go on the internet and you can avoid thoughts or feelings associated with anything because there's just monkey mind going from thing to thing. You also avoid activities and situations that remind you of the trauma, and that leads to isolation. And another thing that can happen is the progression of triggers. Like if you were almost killed in a firefight near a tree line and you're in a park and there are kids playing and you're chewing gum and the car backfires, you can then be triggered in the future, not just by tree lines, but by chewing gum and kids playing. And you don't know it. You just think you're crazy. A lot of people can't remember parts of their tours. My husband has seen a picture of himself in front of a pile of dead bodies at a really famous battle. He has no memory of it. It was too horrifying for him. Another thing that happens is people feel like other people cannot understand them. It's called feeling detached and estranged. And that is reality. And I didn't realize that. I had been interviewing people for my book, and we went to see Platoon. And when we came out of Platoon, there was a guy in there that had his arm blown up, and it was just shredded. It was great makeup, but I said to Bob, God, that was so awful. And he just looked at me and he said, it's worse when it's real. And that's when I realized I don't understand shit about this. I've never been shot at. I've never smelled dead people. I don't know anything about it. The other thing is people who've been in combat don't expect to have a long life because they've seen people their age killed. It's reality. So what I want to say about these things is it's normal. It's normal to be affected by things you've lived through. It is absolutely normal. And, one of the things about vets is they want to be fine. They come back, they don't want to have problems. They just want to go on and have a regular, happy, everyday life. And that didn't happen after Vietnam, and it's not happening now. And one of the things I like to tell them is, well, you are fine, fucked up, insecure, neurotic, and egotistical. It's, and they usually get a good laugh out of that. I can tell you the whole history of PTSD. King Saul in the Bible was troubled by an evil spirit of the Lord, so they send for David. And David comes and plays his harp for Saul. And what does Saul do? He tries to pin him to the wall with a spear. And when I read that, I laughed. I just laughed because Bob would get so mad when I would try to cheer him up. They don't want you cheering them up. They're just mad. There's a book called Achilles in Vietnam. It's about how the Greek warriors also had PTSD. Shakespeare mentions it. And there was a thing called soldier's heart after the Civil War. And when Bob got back from Vietnam, he had an irregular heartbeat a lot of the time. And nobody knew this. This was a scientific paper that came out in 1878, but nobody in the VA had ever read it. So they just told him, well, we don't know what's wrong with your heart, but you might die of it. That was really reassuring for him. In World War I, they called it shell shock. And in World War II, if they were in Europe or in the South Pacific, they called it combat fatigue. If they were in America, they called it combat neurosis. And I read a paper, I tried to read all the papers when I was writing this book. Some guy who had been shot down twice in a bomber. The second time he got to see his friends all burned to death. And the psychiatrist was telling him, the reason you have these problems is you didn't get along with your mom. So that's basically what Vietnam veterans were facing too. Because although there had been a diagnosis called gross stress reaction in the first diagnostic and statistical manual, the second one came out in 1968. It was actually published the week of the Tet Offensive. And in that, they dropped the gross stress reaction. They said if you had a problem, you could have a transient situational disturbance. If you had a problem with something you'd lived through and it lasted more than 6 months, then you were fucked up before it happened. That was it. So that's the end of any diagnosis that could give you help. And that's, when they started just saying, well, you're just a loser and here's some drugs. Now, that's what my husband got at the VA, was here's some drugs. And he did have a psychiatrist who talked to him, but I don't think he ever talked about what he actually went through. They just talked about a bunch of stuff. The drugs he got were Valium. Later on, people got Thorazine, which was terrible for people. It was the worst thing in the world. And now they're getting so many antidepressants that they get serotonin syndrome, which makes them act crazy as hell, just like they had the PTSD that they had, only now it's caused by the serotonin stuff. So, it's really not right. And the other thing that really drives me crazy is it was in 1980, DSM-3, that PTSD was put into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And the diagnostic criteria were written by the kind of psychiatrist who spent an hour a week with each person that they were dealing with. So they knew what it was like, what they were having, what the symptoms were. And they just redid the diagnostic criteria to be an extremely intellectualized, numbing ritual of bullshit. One of the symptoms now is altered cognitions. I just love that. It's just like, I cannot even explain what that means, much less to a veteran or their spouse. So, and they changed the number of symptoms. My personal belief is the first moment of trauma, you start numbing and you start being hypervigilant. And later on, you get re-experiencing, when you have the nightmares or you can't stop thinking about it or you're always talking about it or whatever. But the way they've got it now, it would be really hard for any normal human being to understand what they're talking about, much less say, oh, when that happened to him, that was a traumatic stressor. And this way that he can't listen to people and he just sits here blanked out is a symptom. They don't list them like they did in the first one. One of the things that happens, another thing that makes it worse is disreception. And everybody knows about the disreception after Vietnam, the people calling names and nobody wanting to hear about it and stuff like that. But there's disreception now too. Nobody wants to hear about it. And the worst part of the disreception is psychiatrists giving you all those drugs when what you need to do is fucking talk about it, Of course, some people don't want to talk about it and they would much rather take a pill. I can understand that too. So the other thing, I don't think you should call every veteran you meet a hero. I think that is a stab in the heart to them because they don't think of themselves as heroes. They think the heroes are dead. So if you're telling them, oh, you're my hero, it's just... Okay, so get on to spouses. This is where a lot of the cost of the war is born. spouses tend to take it personally, and they tend to misunderstand what is going on. And that's certainly what I did. I thought Bob was just trying to fuck me over every chance he got. And I didn't notice at the time, but he would turn into an ice man certain times of the year. Sometimes he'd be pretty okay. He'd be really angry sometimes. And I just thought, you know, he's trying to mess me up. And I'm a great wife, so he shouldn't be having any problems. Because all of us know that if you're a good wife, your husband won't have any problems, right? Isn't that the American way? Okay, so, and I thought if I just was perfect, he wouldn't have these problems. And he agreed. We laugh about it now. He also thought he was crazy. He didn't have any idea. So two of the things I want to touch on, depleted cortisol. Guys with chronic PTSD have depleted cortisol. They didn't know that. They thought they would have a high level of cortisol because of the stress. Depleted cortisol means you cannot calm down once you're upset. And one of the worst things about being married to a veteran is if you get into a fight, he won't stop. He just keeps yelling and yelling and yelling and yelling and yelling and yelling. So once I found out about that, I decided that arguing with him was like lighting a match around a guy on oxygen. So what I was going to do was say, this is my method. I'd say, or I'd say, you may be right, and think on Mars. And then after a while, after I got a little bit of recovery, I started realizing sometimes he was right. He used to say I would die before I would admit I was wrong, and I just thought he was a sore loser, because if I had ever been wrong, I would have admitted it. But then I noticed it one day, that I had just been mean to him just mean, and I was wrong. And I went into his office, and he had this look on his face like, oh my God. And I said, this is how I said it. I was wrong. Just like that. And at the moment I said it, I realized, number one, it's a lot of work being right all the time. You gotta lie and maneuver and twist things to do it. And number two, he still loved me, even though I'd been wrong a lot. It was a really, really nice moment. So the other thing about when you're arguing with a veteran is when their heart rate is above 175 beats per minute, any person, not just a veteran, nobody's home up here. They can't hear the words you're saying. So it's just not worth it. I just walk away, and then later on we can talk it over again. But if he starts to get mad, I don't have PTSD. He has PTSD. Why am I arguing with him? Some of the triggers at home, if you're not obeying somebody, it can get you killed. If you're giving orders to a veteran, the orders can get a veteran killed. Slowness can get you killed. One of the people on one of my Facebook groups, wives of veterans with PTSD, was saying how her husband went nuts in this fast food restaurant because the food was slow. And I just said, you do realize that while you were waiting for the food, he was waiting for death. And it was just like, oh. They don't know any of this stuff, so they don't think it. So I'm writing a new book for them. Quickness can get you killed, carelessness can get you killed, and confrontation can get you killed. So, is it the 2 minutes now? Should I shut up? Okay.
Thank you.
My name is Mary Barr, and I'm a member of Chapter 14, Gainesville Vets for Peace. I'm a Vietnam vet myself, but not a combat veteran. Obviously, women weren't even allowed to carry weapons when I was in Vietnam. I was there in 1968, 69, so I was there during My Lai. That's one thing I learned this week, is I was actually, but I was in Saigon and never heard about it. I was an intelligence officer, so I did hear some things that were going on, but certainly not the things that I've learned since. And so one of the things that I do, and I think that's why I was invited to be on this panel, is that if you visit Memorial Mile that we do on Memorial Day, you'll see the posters hanging on the fence about hostile war. And so I've been doing that for 7 or 8 years now, as long as we've been at Memorial Mile. And so I'm going to just give you very brief examples of the kind of cost of war that's mostly on the fence. There's so many different costs of war. But if we looked at it, if you took a dollar bill and looked at it and said that represented the discretionary spending, that's the spending we can choose to spend on things like science and education and healthcare in the US, excluding Medicare. If you looked at, for instance, housing, we spend about 6 cents on housing. On education, again, we spend about 6 cents. We spend on transportation 2 cents. But if you look at the military, 54 cents of that dollar goes to the military. And so when people say, how can we afford to, for instance, not send our children into debt when they try to go to college, or how can we afford for people not to die because they can't afford to buy insulin, look at that 54 cents and think about that's the cost of war for this population. I'm taking the numbers I get from what's called the National Priorities Program, and what that does is then take the taxes we pay and turn them into what we could use them for. So for instance, in Gainesville, and these are 2017 numbers, we paid, as a city, we paid $176.5 million in taxes for the military. This is just military spending. That would have done 9,589 four-year scholarships to a university, like the University of Florida. It would have given 66,480 low-income adults health care for a year. If we look at the county, at Alachua County, countywide, we spent $376.26 million on the military. We could have created 5,079 clean energy jobs. We could have done 16,176 Pell Grants of $5,815 for 4 years with that money. If we look at Florida, tax bill for the military was $39.66 billion. This would have given 24.28 million children health care. And the total for the US of military spending was $647 billion. And by the way, this does not include things like the DART programs for flying drones over other countries and killing their population. So that's kind of the classic idea of cost of war. But when I looked at the My exhibit this week, I thought, well, that's not really even the most, it's important in terms of people's lives here, but if we take a wider view, the My exhibit, I think, for at least taught me that there's another much more important one, and you certainly talked about it, and that's the cost to the people who go to war and the civilians in the country. So let's just look at the story of Hugh Thompson, which I think most of you got. It's got some pictures, and I thought if you don't have it, you can grab one in May, that I'm going to kind of refer to as we go along. So let me tell you who Hugh Thompson is. There's a panel in the My exhibit about him. I actually wrote this article back in 2008 and revisited it for My, because he was part of the history of My. He was a helicopter pilot, quite a remarkable one. Was known as an exceptional pilot. He flew a Scout helicopter. And what I'm going to do is just read from some of this, because most of it is quotes from him and his crew. So Larry Colburn was his gunner, and they were lifelong friends as well. And he described the way this helicopter flew as we were basically bait. Please shoot at me so we can get gunships or artillery on you. So this was to draw the enemy out. March 16th, 1968, the day of My Lai, he was flying cover for Charlie Company, who was the battalion that was in that village of My Lai. And they really, what they were practicing was a a widely used policy in that region of basically destroying the support for the Viet Cong, which would be the villagers, their animals, their buildings, and their crops. And so their job was to destroy those. Now, Charlie Company had some real losses themselves. They lost 28 people from their unit in the month before My Lai, and they just lost their favorite sergeant, a much beloved sergeant. And so what Thompson did was land his helicopter between the troops he was supposed to be protecting and a group of about 10 villagers who were up against a bunker trying to get away so they wouldn't be killed. And he said, I'm going to shoot you if you kill these civilians. And so he defended them and called in another airship who evacuated those civilians. So then he also called his commanding officer and told him what had happened. And we do know now that they stopped the search and destroy operations on the ground at that point, probably that day. But nothing else, he never heard anything else about it until years later. So back in Vietnam, shortly after My Lai, there were reports of murder and mistreatment of Vietnamese civilians, and this went across the desk of an Army major named Colin Powell. And he investigated this, and this was what his report said, quote, relations between American soldiers and Vietnamese people are excellent. So the whitewash of My Lai had begun. And you probably know who Colin Powell is. He went on to become a 4-star general. He was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was Secretary of Defense for two presidents.
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, excuse me. Yes. So after My Lai, Thompson was sent back in to fly the remainder of his Vietnam tour as a scout without a gunship to cover him. He was hit by enemy fire 8 times. He was shot down 4 times. And probably luckily for him, the last crash left him with a back injury, and that ended his duty in Vietnam. He probably saved his life. He went on to, he finally got a commission as a major, and he retired from the military after training other people to fly helicopters. He was a warrant officer in Vietnam. That was often who flew the choppers. So Thompson went for 30 years after reporting this and after Seymour Hersh broke the story about My Lai, getting abuse from his fellow soldiers. He'd walk into a mess hall where he was stationed and everybody would get up and leave. He received death threats. He had dead animals put on his porch. And so finally in 1988, he was awarded the Soldier's Medal, and with tears in his eyes, he said, for all of the men who served their country with honor on the battlefields of Southeast Asia, and there were people who served with honor, despite the system. Thompson died of cancer in 2006, but before he did, he lectured on battlefield ethics at West Point and the Naval Academy and other military academies. And he and his crew's actions became an example used in military manuals, both in the US and Europe. West Point Dean Colonel Tom Holditz described his impact. There are so many people today walking around the lot because of him, not only in Vietnam, but people who kept their units under control under other circumstances because they had heard his story. We may never know just how many lives he saved. So that is the story of an American soldier, and that's what we've been hearing so far. But and this is what the exhibit is about, let's look at the My Lai massacre through the eyes of Thompson, and his gun, Larry Coleman. And so here's some things they said. As they came into the area, they saw a lot of bodies. They flagged them with smoke when they saw movement for rescue, and then they watched as Charlie Company came in and killed them instead of rescuing them. And at first they couldn't bring themselves to believe what was happening, but when they finally did, he set his helicopter down, and between them and just said, just hold your fire right now. I think I can do better than using a hand grenade on them. This is what they were going to do, these 10 civilians. So he ordered his crew to shoot if the squad attacked the civilians. So Larry Colburn describes this as, there were a million things going through my mind. The first thing, I wanted no one to think I was going to raise an M60 machine gun and draw on them, or they draw on us. I remember pointing my muzzle straight at the ground so there'd be no mistake. We had a little stare down, and Thompson at this point was having a shouting match with the soldier with the lieutenant who was commanding this particular squad. So they got the civilians out, and then on their way out of the village, they again saw movement amongst the bodies in a ditch. And they landed, and Glenn, the crew chief, brought a small child out of the ditch and handed him up to Colburn, who said, the child sat on my lap, limp. He had a blank 1,000-yard stare. I couldn't even make him blink. He was in severe shock. He had no broken bones, no bullet holes, but he was completely drenched with blood. And Glenn had picked him up. He was still clinging to his dead mother. They delivered the child to Quinine Hospital and Orphanage. They assumed at the time he was only 4 or 5, but when they met him again in 2001, they found he had been 8 years old, and after staying at the hospital for 2 days, that he left and went back to the village, 10 miles through the jungle, to make sure his parents were properly buried. So here's your civilian experience. And there's a picture, if you have that out, the last picture on that handout, you'll see a picture. There's Hugh Thompson, Larry Colburn, who I've been writing about. The little boy that they rescued from the ditch is there. He's now a young man. And the little boy he's in front is Hugh Thompson's son. So, that's the cost of war in my eyes.
Hi, my name is Richard Hutchins, and I was drafted in 1967, and I arrived in Vietnam 3 weeks before the Tet Offensive. I spent 13 months there, and after I got out of the military, I went to Europe, got a degree here, and I wanted to work someplace to help my fellow Vietnam veterans, or fellow veterans. And so I got a job, I deliberately sought out and got a job at the VA. I spent 30 years there. So that's me. They asked me to be here, the cost of war. I know that the VA budget, for example, this year is $198 billion, just under $200 billion. But 10 years ago, it was only half that. So it's been increasing. I mean, the thing is doubled. 10 years ago, it was 97 billion. Today, it's 198.6 billion. So, and a large part of this, half of it, is for what they call compensation, disability payments to the disabled veterans. The disability payments are, for this year, is also, it's $97 billion. $97 billion goes to disabled veterans. Most of that's all service-connected disabilities, meaning that something that happened to them in the military. Although there are, and that's for right just a hair under 5 million veterans receive disability, 4.9 something. And but on top of that, there's a 250,000 veterans that receive pension, which is an income supplement program for veterans, wartime veterans who have a lower income to be able to supplement their income. And it also, and on top of that, there's 500,000 survivors they receive, survivors of veterans that also receive VA benefits. And so it comes out, like I said, it's $97 billion. And although Mary pointed out that the Defense Department budget is 54% of discretionary income, well, that's true. But out of the whole budget, that's because a lot of the federal budget are payments that they have to make, they're required to make, like interest payments on the national debt, for example. But out of the whole, all of the income of the United States, the total revenue of the United States, the Department of Defense and the VA take up 25%, a little over 25%, 1/4 of all the money that the federal government takes in, the revenue, is spent on this. That is the Department of Defense and the VA. And the Department of Defense is $686 billion this year. So for a total of $884 billion this year to the VA and to the Department of Defense. And actually, I've worked at the VA and I've dealt with a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists, and I didn't mention I had a problem with drinking too much alcohol. Would they have recommended I smoke pot?
It's unusual, that's unusual.
I should have seen them all.
My mother was a psychiatrist at the Boston VA outpatient clinic, and Vietnam veterans came in and asked for her by name, because she listened to them.
That's great. I guess that's all. There's a total right now in the United States, there's a total of just under 22 million veterans. About 21.9 million veterans right now in the United States. And it used to be the Vietnam veterans were the biggest group, but they're dying off now. I'm 72, and I was there when I turned 21. So it's why I was in Vietnam 50 years ago, 51. So, but among those 22 million veterans we have now, the biggest group now is Gulf War veterans. That's 7.3 million. And in Vietnam now is 7.1 million. And then, of course, there's only just over 500,000 World War II veterans still with us, and a little over 1.5 million Korean War veterans. And the rest are different areas and peacetime veterans. I just thought that was interesting. I thought I'd share that. But that's all I really had to say. Thank you.
Now we have time for Q&A, questions, thoughts. Please try to keep them as concise as possible. And also briefly identify yourself too. Tell us who you are, and our panelists are open to take questions.
Richard, statistics. I'm Pierce Butler. I'm a civilian member of the local Vets for Peace chapter. Richard, statistics reminded me of something that Noam Chomsky pointed out, that I think we should point out when we hear all the Republicans speaking about socialism and so forth. One of the other costs of monetary costs of our huge military establishment is that basically it's turned the U.S. into a socialist country. Our economics are dictated by the military budget. The whole industrial policy that the government has is set up to provide more materials to aviation, to electronics. All those sorts of things that came to dominate our economy are because of government investment.
Can I say something?
I'd just like to point out that even though there's all those veterans, when you talk to people whose husbands have come back with an injury and they're trying to get service connected for it, it takes forever. and they will send in the paperwork and it'll get lost. And this happens over and over again. It happened after Vietnam too. The compensation system thinks that's their own personal money. The treatment system in the VA hospitals is better. They want to help people, but the ones who are, handling the money and saying, oh, you're not really. I actually had a Vietnam veteran who was told they didn't have a traumatic stressor because seeing his captain killed was normal for being in combat, so it wasn't a traumatic stressor. That's a kind of nuttiness. I also talked to a guy who talked to a psychiatrist here at the Gainesville place, and he said he'd been at Hamburger Hill, and she said to him, oh, I saw the movie. It can't have been as bad as that.
Yes.
I'm Susan Hutchins. I'm married to Richard Hutchins. And just having heard at home so many stories that you told, I mean, you protected people's benefits and helped people get the benefits they deserve. Can you speak to that at all, about what it was like being the go-between between the veteran in need and the agency that issued benefits?
Oh, that's true. Well, when I worked for the VA, I did all kinds of different jobs there, but Veterans Benefits Counselor, I did that for several years, and that's basically getting the maximum benefits available for a veteran. And so many veterans aren't even aware of what they're eligible for, much less know how to go about obtaining it. And so that's what I did that. That was a really rewarding thing. I still got people come up to me and say, oh, well, thanks, we're doing this and stuff like that.
Was it difficult getting the funds to come down, or was it a matter of getting the right documents and the right information to the veterans administration?
Well, yeah, that was the idea. You go ahead and put together the whole package for the application, so they didn't have to come back to you and say, oh, wait a minute, we need this too, or we need this too. So if you have somebody who knows what they're looking for to begin with, then you can put it all together and just send it in one time, you're done with it. That's what you meant, I guess. Thank you.
My name is George Melevich, and I'm not a veteran, but I have gone to talks by veterans, such as one who became a Buddhist monk, Claude and Thomas. He wasn't a pilot in a helicopter, he was a helicopter crew chief. And he firmly believes now that war, which I totally agree, puts people in I'll call it inhuman situation. And I don't know about war from an experiential, because I never was in one, but from what I hear, I haven't heard much talk about, I hear about and I understand that veterans need benefits. And like one time I went to a car show and there was a fellow there, a veteran, missing both legs with the prostheses, and he had his car he was showing with hand controls. That's very sad. He didn't need to have that happen to him. And I've also been to talks by a Army veteran, Paul Chappelle. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him, Captain Paul Chappelle, who has written books about Is Peace Possible? How am I trying to get at this? That I see, the usual thing is we've got all these evil people who want to kill us, therefore we have to arm ourselves to the teeth with new nuclear weapons, with, more we sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. They use the weapons someplace else. You know, I just, I see that it's almost like war is taken for granted, that, you know, human beings naturally just go to war and kill each other. But there are some people around, such as Captain Paul Chappelle, who believe it's possible to change this. And I would just like whoever would like to comment on that.
And Gainesville Veterans for Peace is the place for you. Because this is, that's our philosophy. War is not inevitable. It is not in human nature to kill and violate and rape and invade other countries. That belief, the idea that war is in human nature, is only taught in very small parts of the world, including the United States, unfortunately. But Gainesville Veterans for Peace, all the literature we have, the experiences of being veterans and spouses and supporters of veterans, we know that war is not inevitable, but we also know that war does what you're talking about, which is, I mean, our belief is that there's no good war. We talk about the cost of war. That's what we really try to focus on. And that's one of the reasons why this memorial is so important. And what the memorial teaches us, the exhibit, is that My Lai was one of many massacres. It wasn't the only massacre, it wasn't the first, it wasn't the last. That the broader war creates that situation of inhumanity. It makes us inhuman.
I just wanted to say that one of the things I always point out is that responses to trauma are fight, flee, or freeze. And you wouldn't have to have basic training if fight was the automatic one. So people have to be trained to fight. But the other thing I want to say is that when I was doing this book, I interviewed a lot of people, young people who were 18 when they were over there. And I realized that when you're 18, you have black and white thinking. And I had very black and white thinking when I was 18. And if I had been over there to save these people's butts and they had killed my friends, I would have killed them too. I have no doubt about that. I was just completely black and white thinking. I had never heard of the shades of gray. So you got to remember that, you know, it's kids that volunteer to do this. Now they're older because they can hardly get anybody in the military, so people stay in. But in a war like this, it was very young people who were not thinking like grown-ups. You know, your brain doesn't finish till you're 24 developing. So I have a lot of empathy for them.
I was going to say, too, that in the article, Larry Colburn says about the men in Charlie Company that so few of them came forward, almost none, but many of them did commit suicide, and some of the suicides were connected to their experiences in the massacre, because he said, you know, we flew back to base and slept in a clean bed every night, and they spent the night. And the night was when the Viet Cong, at that time we didn't have the night vision goggles and the infrared weapons that we have now. That's when the Viet Cong they ruled the battlefield at night. And so these guys had to depend on each other for their very lives. And if they ratted out the guy who's going to protect them or get them evacuated if they're injured, that it could cost them their life. So he could understand how, you know, they were coerced by, as Scott describes, the rules of engagement of the battlefield and the policy of the people in the helicopters overhead telling the field commanders what to do. So you put people in impossible situations, and sure, they're going to come back with all kinds of problems.
Hey, my name's Megan. My dad was in the Marines, and he joined because he wasn't a citizen of the United States. He came from Guatemala, and he needed to pay for college, and he got his citizenship through the Marines. So it's very important to him, and at this point he loves war, he loves the US government, he loves all of this. And then when he tells me about his experiences in the Marines, and he got into the Marines right around when Vietnam was winding down, he tells me all these funny stories, and to me, when he's telling them to me, I'm like, that's a horrible story. He's like, they would call us faggots, they'd beat us up, it was awesome, they'd talk horribly about women, it was so funny. I was like, oh, I'm horrified, Father. This is terrible. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I talk to my dad about like the things that I saw him go through that he's romanticized. He has so much anger inside of him, and I'm like, should I just leave him alone? I see himself, hurting me, hurting all of us, and he like was always pro all of this until the only time he began to question any of it was when Trump was elected. He was like, maybe the government's not that great, but still he loves it because it's what gave him his citizenship. So how do I talk to him about it? It's him mad.
We have a saying in Vets for Peace, honor the warrior, not the war. So you might think of that.
May I see? People who are professional or who make the military their living, they're career officers, whatever. They love war because war means promotions, more money for them. I used to hear officers talking, about how, well, Vietnam's not that big a war, but hey, it's the only one we got. It's like, it's better than nothing. And it took me a while to figure out what they were talking about. Well, obviously, everybody gets promoted. You got more people, a bigger budget. Anyway, so they're, generally speaking, a lot of professional military people are for war. We're certainly preparing for the war.
Can I ask a question also? I'm an occupational therapist, but home health. And I've had the privilege of speaking to so many people in their 80s and 90s. And when you were counting veterans, I had the privilege and this unusual thing happened. I was treating in West Virginia in a hollow, and I treated 2 different people in neighboring hollows from the Battle of the Bulge at the same time. Can you imagine? So count those in your count. At the same time. They were both in their 90s. I was like, what is happening? At the same time, I was treating them. The Battle of the Bulge? What? So yeah, you can believe I listened to their stories, but that's the point I wanted to make.
Sometimes when you don't know what to do, just listen. Just sit and listen. It might be uncomfortable, but if you just sit and listen, in that moment, that might be all they need, to just sit and listen.
Yeah, I agree with that. Acceptance is the answer. People are where they're at. And if, we all hate to be criticized and told how to improve. Believe me, your dad hates it too. And, listening can be a very healing thing. And I'm sorry, I have the same sense of humor. My husband says horrible things and I say them right back. I think they're hilarious. Veterans have a really weird sense of humor. And it's okay. We're allowed to, and so are the wives. If, you've been living with somebody for 55 years, you're probably going to think a lot alike.
Sometimes uncomfortable humor is the only way you can get through things.
Yeah, humor is a way to get through it and to laugh at the things that really hurt you.
Okay, next we have Mrs.
Yeah, I think that, didn't they just say that it was against our Constitution not to allow women to be drafted?
No, it's unconstitutional to just draft men.
Oh, okay, just.
That's cause for alarm.
Okay, so that, is that being promoted now because they need people in the military?
No, it's men's rights has actually started a suit. A men's right who said it's not fair that only guys get drafted, not in Texas.
Right,
It's good old
so if they win and then they draft women too, then they'll have plenty of.
I think it'll be challenged in the higher court.
There is no draft.
Now, excuse me, even though there's no draft,
Folks, let's one at a time, please. Thank you.
even though there's no draft, you're right, they used to draft only men only. And they had a Supreme Court case on it because they were saying, hey, we want equal women are equal to men, why don't you draft women too? And the court said that no, it's okay to draft men only because women were excluded from combat back then. So, but several years ago, they removed all restrictions, all MOSs, military occupational specialties of combat, so that women are eligible for everything that a man is. And therefore, that's why they reversed the decision, because the whole decision back then, when they said men only, was predicated on the premise that women were excluded from combat. But now that everything's equal, if they ever draft people again, they're going to have to draft men and women. Good luck with that.
Well, Sheila, I'm a veteran for peace. Paul, maybe you can give her a copy of your latest book. I think for your dad, like education, if he's willing to read about it. And I know Paul was in Central America, and in Veterans for Peace, we were doing a peace vigil last week, and we have a sign that says "Hands off Venezuela." Well, everyone's horrified that people are suffering so much there. The U.S. always has a way to turn everything into a military excursion. And in Paul's book, he focuses in his writings about how we've been invading for hundreds of years, and a lot of it was in Central America. And it's the U.S. has to always gin up wars to help the military contractors and stuff, but Paul could give you a copy of his book, maybe your dad will read it. And then there's a lot of books here that talks about, it's not shameful that he did follow in the military as an economic into history in his family, but
for people of color, Mexican Americans, it's the very same thing, even though we technically had citizenship. Being in the military was really our only claim to citizenship. In this society, good luck finding any anti-war community. That's why Gainesville Veterans for Peace is such a precious place for me as a combat vet, because where I grew up, and even now, liberals, conservatives are pro-war. Very few of them will ever come out against a war, ever, in this country. One of the important things about this book by Michael Kerr is just gadgets. He says, through the entire Vietnam War, maybe 1 or 2% of the media question anything the U.S. military ever said in Vietnam. So it's such a pro-war society. I'm not surprised to hear, about your father and the struggles that you're having. Where do you go in the society to find sanctuary from violence? It's very rare. And again, even the so-called, where I grew up, Norm Dix, Scoop Jackson, Henry Magnuson, all liberal Democrats, pro-war to the end. All pro-war. Why? Because of military-industrial complex. And so how do we fight out of that problem? Yes.
And now we have the president, that I'm sure most of us hate, saying we cannot be the world police, which is what I've been saying for years. And now I'm agreeing with him.
we don't only be for about 30 seconds.
You want to change his mind?
Yeah, Joe Porter. Patience, I was wondering if you have been able to update your book where it includes vets from the Gulf War era. And
I haven't updated this at all. I'm ready to do one.
Oh, you're going to do one?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a whole different thing, like you said, with older people being brought into the war due to economic concerns.
Yes.
And, also just, it's still...
And, basically they're being fucked over, just like Vietnam. They're not being taken care of. They're being sent over. If they have PTSD, they send them there with pills. They get so many different SSRIs that they get a thing called serotonin syndrome, which makes you totally crazy. And, they come back, they go to the VA, delay, delay, delay. Oh, you needed another piece of paper. Oh, we lost your papers. There was a study by Vietnam Veterans of America years ago where they discovered that at least the place in St. Pete was filing all these veterans' papers in the circular file. They were just throwing them away. Then they'd have to reapply, and and that's still happening.
So a couple more questions. We have time for a minute.
I just want to say that wasn't Richard putting it in, sir.
No, I know.
It speaks to the young in the front row here, but first of all, I want to be clear that Veterans for Peace is not just for veterans and veterans function, so it's a great to find out. And are there any mediator, counseling, family-oriented services or anything for people that are trying to work out problems that have been brought home by the veteran?
Well, we have a vet center in Gainesville. Yeah, that's a good place to go. At the VA, I don't know what their program is like right now.
But you recommend the vet centers?
Yeah, vet centers. Yes, that's a good place to go. And I'm sure there are some good people at the VA. People who go to work at the VA want to help people. But if you're a newly produced PhD, you may really believe that you have a 12-week manualized program that will cure PTSD. But you better not let the veterans swear in the meetings. That's...
But as far as helping families talk to each other and figure things out, how to understand that.
Well, if you want something that helps with that, get this book and go to my website, which is patiencepress.org. I wrote a newsletter for 7 years called the Post-Traumatic Gazette, and it covers anger, it covers numbness, it covers various things, validation and invalidation, self-compassion and self-pity, all kinds of things. And there's also stuff, there's the gazettes, then there's for kids. I've written 4 books for kids. One's called Why Is Daddy Like He Is? And then for women who went to war, Why Is Mommy Like She Is? And then for trauma survivors. Okay, and then there's things for spouses. There's the pamphlet that's on everybody's chair, and there's one called The War at Home, which talks about each symptom, what it does for the vet at the time, what it does to him later, and how this family might perceive it, and the different things that might help you get better. So I've written a lot of stuff, and I'm basically unknown anymore. I don't get invited to VAs to give talks, and nobody in the new veterans community knows that I exist. But I have a brain, and I've come up with a lot of stuff that is helpful. Thanks. Not that I'm bragging or anything.
Yeah, I've read articles more during the Gulf War period than lately about the military giving troops in the field all sorts of drugs, mostly amphetamines, because they want to get around this inconvenient human habit of sleeping and getting tired. And do you have any idea what the impact of that is on the people who go through, the ones who survive all that and are at least accustomed to drug dependency, even if not totally controlled by it?
I really don't know. I do know that in Vietnam they were giving people speed, and the best speed you went down to the village and bought on the black market, because the French speed was much better than American speed, and they liked it. But sending people to war when they already have PTSD is wrong. When my husband was diagnosed with combat fatigue in something like 67 or 68, he got a piece of paper that said he could never be sent back into a combat zone, not even a zone. That's the way they treated it. And now they send them back on pills. It's really wrong. There's never been a study of whether it's safe or not. The Israelis have studies of people who've been in war after war. And if you have PTSD in one war, in the next war, you're going to get faster and worse. So it's totally wrong.
Actually, they issued us amphetamines in Vietnam. When you first get there, they issue all people who come into the country. They issued this little pack with certain stuff in it, and I looked through it. You know, it's got certain things in it, and one of them was a packet of little white pills. You know, it's don't take unless ordered by an officer. Okay, so I was on a troop transport with about 8 other guys in the back of a deuce and a half, and we were driving somewhere, and somebody wanted a cigarette or whatever, and so I pulled this out, and I had this pack of little white pills, and one of the guys goes, "Look at this guy! He's got a brand new pack!" And he grabbed it, and everybody else took them, just like that. That was within my first couple of days. That was within my first couple of days. So I didn't take any myself, but they all went like that.
One more very short
Just got two questions. I just watched a movie about war correspondent, a reporter, and her PTSD because she had seen more violence and more death and more atrocities than the average soldier because she kept going back to these war zones. So, I mean, it affects more than just the combat.
It doesn't have to be.
Right.
Yeah, that's why I suggested the book on war dispatches. So we have to wrap up because we want to give you a little bit of time at least if you came straight to the panel to see this amazing exhibit, the Eli Master Memorial exhibit. It's interactive. Please sign in and give us your thoughts. But let's conclude here by giving our panelists a warm round of applause. Veterans for Peace, we have a sign-up sheet. If you want to interview, we have a sign-up sheet for that too. Thank you so much.
How long is this exhibit up?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Actually, till 4 p.m. today.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much.